Okay, so you can see that the Japanese, right, had a very, very different model. They had cheap capital. Now this is what the Japanese, this is what the Koreans, this is what the Singaporeans have done, is they've made cheap capital available to their companies, and they've allowed those companies to go around the world with cheap capital costs into markets where it's going to be easy for them to win. You know, think about Singapore Airlines, right? Singapore Airlines is a wonderful airline, and I don't in any way want to insult the ingenuity of the business model that Singapore Airlines has been able to craft. But when your cost of capital was 0 or 0.5%, and you're competing against, let's say, some of the American airlines, who might have been working with a 12% cost of capital, a 10% cost of capital, even to this day, a 6 or 7% cost of capital. Well, if you have to invest $1 billion in planes, and one group is paying $60 million a year, okay, to finance that, and the other side is paying about $6 million, well, we can see that the firm that's going to win, or the organization that's going to win, is the one that's paying $54 million less just for the money that they need. Right? So this was just an amazing competitive advantage for the Japanese. And what you started to see was companies like Toyota investing more in robotics than the entire US economy at some points in the 1990s, because capital was free. I mean, it was a 0% cost of capital. Okay, so what they wanted to do is produce as cheaply as possible. Now, as they started to use those robots to produce those Toyotas, what happened to quality? The quality went up. Similarly, on the other side, you've got the Americans, and they've got a high capital cost. They can't invest in the robotics. So this was the huge difference between the supply side economies and the demand side economies. And like I say, looking at this list here, okay, in my lifetime, okay, the economies and the interest rate pictures were really what drove a lot of business and a lot of business capabilities. You had the Korean firms, the West German firms, the Singaporeans, the Taiwanese. They had these supply side economies with very low cost of capital, and they were outproducing everybody based on the ability to put cheap capital behind their industries and then move to scale. So anytime that you compete with the Koreans or the Japanese, they're always looking to put capital in place and then produce a lot of it. Okay, cheap capital, produce at scale, and beat everybody else in the marketplace. Okay, and that was the supply side economy. Now look, these supply side economies and demand side economies started to compete in the early 1980s. Now I could spend a lot of time going into things like currencies and trade regulations and trade deals and international wrangling that took place. Okay, a lot of things went on in the 1990s, okay, where there was a lot of wrangling back and forth. Even in the 1980s, things like the Plaza Accord, which was signed in Vienna, which set currency translation rates for the next 15 years. These were very, very significant in bringing order to the world. But the economies, at that time were in a great departure. Okay, you had the hyperinflationary economies, which we saw down in Latin America, where you had 100+ interest rates, okay, competing against economies like Japan, Singapore, with 1%, 2%, 3% economy interest rates. Very, very different companies. And they invested differently. They structured themselves differently. Okay, the investment, as I said, in Toyota in robots was greater than the investment of robots in the entire US economy in the 1990s. That's one company out investing the largest economy in the world. It just shows you what Japan began to look like. Okay. Now, look, this is just one element. This is our first element, okay, the economy. Let's pick up on number 3 here, the demography. And let's look forward and look at a little bit of the demography. And then I'm going to explain kind of some of the shifts that occurred. Now, if I look at demography, okay, you can outrun a lot of things. But population is one of those things that once put in place is very, very, very hard to change. It usually takes 19 years to change your demographic structure. That is, you have to conceive a child and raise it until it's a proper work age. Okay, so demography is something that generally takes a long time to change. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is that, you know, around the world, okay, there was what we called a population boom. Okay, it started around the 1950s and it continued until today. But it's been very, very uneven. Okay, when I was a child in America, I was part of the baby boom. And the baby boom was from 1948 to 1963. And during that time period, okay, the average American female had about 4.5 children. In 1960, the average American female was having 4.36 children. So we were having a lot of kids. And anytime that your population reproduction rate, the number of children that a female has, over 2.1, the population tends to grow. So as long as you're having more than 2.1 births, because some of the children will die young and things like this, okay, but 2.1 births generally leads to population growth. Now, the average American female was having double that rate. So the US population started to explode. This is why we called it the baby boom. And if you think about demand, demand takes what? Takes a lot of people. Okay? So all of a sudden you have the American female, okay, or the American family, if you will, having double the population replacement rate, your population starts growing, right? And as the population starts to grow, what happens? Well, that's one of the engines of demand. You have more mouths to feed, more children to clothe. You have more educational spending. You need more everything. Houses need to be bigger. You need to make bicycles. You have to build schools. Whatever it is, it creates economic activity in and of itself. Okay? Now, what happened to the US population? Well, if we look at the chart, okay, you see in 1950, the average, or the population of the US was about 171 million. And the average female was having quite a few kids, okay, about 4.36. But by 2019, our population grew to 329 million, or we grew about 92% over the last 70 years. If I look at our neighbors in Latin America, you notice that our neighbors in Latin America have grown roughly about 300%, or about 3 times as fast as the US population. Okay? So the growth rate, or the population, those people that are going to consume, has grown about 3 times as fast in Latin America. But recognize, right, it's not just population. It's also income. So let's go back for just a second and look at our fourth factor here. There's demography, but there's also social and cultural issues. Now, in 1950, the average female was having 4.5 kids or thereabouts. 1960, they were still having 4.36 children. So the US population is growing, and investors are showing up to meet the needs of this demanding, burgeoning population. But what starts to happen is all of a sudden the US birth rate slows down. And we see that the US birth rate must have slowed down here because the population only grew 92%. what started to happen? Well, all of a sudden we had a social and cultural change. The average female stopped having as many children. It dropped from 4.3 births in 1960 to by 1980, the average female was having about 1.8 children. So as you look at this chart and you look at, we look at the fertility rate for the United States, in 1980, the average female was already down to 1.8 children. Now, as I said earlier, replacement or stable population is about 2.1 births per female. Now, in 1980, the average American male, the column to the left, was living to be 71, and the average female would live to be 78. Now we see in 2019, those have moved up to 78 and 82 respectively. And that's been the reason the US population has continued to grow, because the birth rate is below the normal replacement rate. So without immigration and without an extension in life, the US population would have already started to decline. But people are living longer, and we do have immigration, and that's why the US population continues to grow. But it doesn't grow as fast as it does for some of these countries here, right? So what we see is the US population begins to slow down. Why does it slow down? Because women went into the workforce. In 1960, 19% of females were working outside of the home. By 1980, 79% of women worked outside of the home. What did that mean? It meant a massive shift in income in the traditional household structure. So you went from 19% of women working outside of the house, earning a second wage, to where 79% of women were working outside of the home. All of a sudden, the demand side economy had more money. So demand kept going. Even though the population wasn't growing as fast, the income in the household was growing fast. And this is what made the economy grow. This was the essence of the demand side economy of the US. But look, by 1980, what starts to happen? Population is flat. You can see we're not growing in population. And by 1980, 79% of women were working outside of the home. We went from 19% in 1960 to 79% in 1980. Now what starts to happen? All the women are working already. I don't know how high the number is going to go. What will female employment top out at? 83%, 85, 90? I don't know. Okay, but I can tell you the big move was between 19 and 79. When those 60% of females moved into the workforce, that was the secular move that drove the economy. But by 1980, the gains, you were starting to hit a ceiling in terms of females in the workforce. The birth rate is down, no more new people. All of a sudden, America's demand side economy begins to fall on hard times. Now, what did America do? What was the response over in America? Well, America began to move towards more of a supply side economy. Up until 1980, and before Ronald Reagan came into office, we didn't have pension plans. We didn't have retirement savings. We didn't have the ability to put money into an individual retirement account. That was started in 1980 with DIDMAC, Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act. 1982, we moved up from $1,000 to $2,000 that you could put into an IRA. In 1986, they came back with the Gramm-Rudman Act, which was about allowing Americans to save for their retirement. And they started to scare people and say, Social Security might not be here, but you can put 15% of your income away into a retirement account or $30,000, whichever is less. Okay, 15% of your income or $30,000. Suddenly what happened? Americans started saving more and more money for their retirement. Okay, now this isn't called savings. It's not called savings because it's deferred income. That money goes into those retirement accounts and it's taxed when it comes out. This allowed the government to have money when it came out of these accounts, so you'll still have income and the government will still be able to pay its transfer payments. But it was also something that encouraged people to put money away today, to defer that income until a later stage in their life. Now, those, what I would call deferred benefit plans or retirement savings, were something that allowed the U.S. economy to have what? More money, more supply of funds. And we talked about earlier, supply side economy, suddenly more and more money is going into savings in the form of these pension plans, and that money or that capital is lowering interest rates in the United States. Let me tell you how much of a significant shift that was. Those pension plans were started, and that defined benefit program was started in 1986, pension plans in 1980. And by 1993, if considered savings, those pension plans represented 93%, really easy one to remember, by 93% of all savings in the United States was in the form of these pension plans. So this was something that by 1980, we didn't even have this asset class or this savings class. And by 1993, it's 93% of our savings. What happened to interest rates in the United States? They broke and they came down. And all of a sudden, America wasn't at this enormous investment disadvantage versus the Japanese, versus the Koreans. And this is when the U.S. economy began to really turn around. Okay? And this is what we saw through the late 1980s all the way up through the 2000s. Okay? This was when the U.S. economy roared back. Why? Cheaper capital. The capital rate spread was a great deal lower. Now let's take a look at some of the populations around the world, just for curiosity. So we see the Americas here. Okay, and one of the things we notice when we look at the Americas is the fertility rate in 1980. If we look at most of Latin America, it was double the rate of the United States. So it grew quicker. Okay, if I look at the fertility rates in Latin America, they're all down around replacement rate. And if I look at where their world rank is out of the 203 countries that were reporting, okay, USA was 142nd. Okay, you can see Brazil there is 151, but most of them are right around 100. Okay, so the higher the number, the fewer children they're having. Okay, so the US was having 1.77. Okay, Mexico was having 2.14. Okay, the lower the birth rate, the higher the number. Okay, now let's look at Europe. Okay, if I look at Europe, okay, by 1980, Europeans were living longer than the Americans. Okay, we see higher life expectancies. But look at where those fertility rates were by 1980. They were all substantially below 2. Okay, as I move to 2019, what do I see here? Austria, Greece, Italy, okay, Spain. Look at how low those birth rates are. All of those birth rates are under 2. And if I look at their world rank, okay, their world rank is very, very high, closer to 200. So they're some of the lowest birth rates in the world, right? And look at those life expectancies, 80 to 84, 80 to 86, 81 to 86. Okay, people are living a long time over in Europe. So what do you have in Europe? You have a very old population and a population that is not reproducing itself. And now what's starting to happen in Europe is the death rate is actually ahead of the birth rate. Okay, we're starting to see more deaths than births every year in Europe. Well, if Europe is starting to shed people, what's an acceptable growth rate for Europe? If you're an administrator in Europe, just think about this for a second. What does that mean for you if you're an administrator in Europe? it means that your growth rate should possibly be negative, or that 0 might be a good birth rate. If you have fewer people and you have a 0 birth rate, maybe that's acceptable. Now, I don't think I'd want to be the politician that runs on, we're going to grow at 0%. But you can see what's starting to happen. Europe is actually declining in terms of its population. And when you look at these countries here on this list, like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, they're not up on the list. Okay, what are those? Those are the worst economies of Europe, partially because they don't have any people. And the young people are not having children. Okay, as they look at the economic uncertainty, as they look at the poor economies, and we'll talk about those in just a second, all of a sudden what's happening? These young people are choosing not to have children. And why is that such a downward spiral? Because the one thing that young people do that old people can't do is have kids. So you always have to look at your population and ask yourself how much of it is old and how much of it is young. Because, once you get post 40, you don't have a lot of children. When you get post 50, you're not having children. And certainly in your 70s and 80s, you're not reproducing. So when you start looking at a population, it's very important that you track that group of people under 20 years of age, because that's the group that's going to reproduce. That's the group that's going to keep your population growing. If you don't have a lot of people in that age group, you're going to have a lot of deaths versus births going forward. Okay? Now, let's kind of look at Asia, and then we're going to take a little bit of a look at the world. If I look at Asia, okay, what does Asia look like? Okay, well, Asia's a hard place to talk about in just a simple one statement or a sweeping statement. We have places like Hong Kong where people are living a very, very long time, but have very, very low birth rates. You can see they're 191st out of the 202 countries that are reporting. Look at South Korea, okay, a 1.11 birth rate, or they're number 200. As a matter of fact, 10 of the 12 lowest birth rates in the world are in East Asia. Okay, who has the lowest? Well, most years it's going to be Singapore or it's going to be Taiwan. Okay, this particular year, 2019, Singapore had a lot of tax advantages for people to go out and have children. The government is trying to stimulate people to have children, so the birth rate has jumped up a little bit in Singapore at the moment, and their birth rate has moved them up to about 197 out of 203 countries. But you can just see how low all of these are. But then we also have neighbors out there like Indonesia that are still above the replacement rate. The Philippines, 2.58 births. Okay, these populations are still growing. Now let's take a look, and I'm going to just briefly talk about where is this going to take us. Now, look, if I were to look at a projection I did just looking at the world population reports back in 2012, okay? Tanzania and Spain, roughly the same size countries. According to the World Population Reports, populations 48 and 46 million respectively. Okay, projected population in 2050, given that the average Tanzanian was having 5.4 children and the average Spaniard was having about 1.4, they were projecting that their populations would be 134 million versus 48 million. Or two countries that look the same today in 2012, by 2050, one was going to be 3 times the size of the other. Okay, now look at that population under 15. That population under 15, 45% of Tanzania's population is under 15. Those are the future child bearers. Okay, only 15% of Spain's population is under 15 years of age. So you can see Spain is not going to grow. 33%, 1/3 of the population is over 65. They're not going to reproduce. Only 3% of Tanzania's population is over 65. If Tanzania's health situation, their medical situation is such that they're able to extend lives there, this is where your population explosion could start, is in a place like Tanzania. But I see a lot of activity in the developed nations, and they're talking about, oh, so many people on the planet, so much of this, so much of that. Look, over the next 30 years, the developed world is going to decline in terms of its total population. All of the population growth is going to come out of the developing world. Okay, look at where these projections are for 2050 off of a 2015 base. Okay, the Philippines was 109 million in 2015. It's expected there'll be 171 million. That means they're going to grow 62 million people, okay, by 2050. Now, if you're Indian, that doesn't sound like a heck of a lot, right? You've got 1.3 billion or 1.2 billion population. Okay, but if you're in Singapore, what does that mean? Okay, 62 billion, that's 62 million is 10 Singapores over the next 35 years that are going to be created in the Philippines. If I look at Spain, as I had said earlier, off the 2012 number, not much of a change. If I look at Indonesia, okay, expected to grow about 55 million people. Look at Germany. Germany is expected to shed 10 million people on a population of 81 million, or about 12.5% of the population. Now, the reason I use the 2015 number is because, Germany has never been very pro on immigration. But all of a sudden, when the Middle Eastern immigration or refugees began coming, Germany was kind of open to this, right? Or Angela Merkel and the government was kind of open towards taking immigrants. Was it compassion? Was it economically motivated? I don't know. You can draw your conclusions. But one of the things that we see here is that the population for Germany was kind of bleak. 81 million expected to drop to 71. If I look at a place like Japan, 127 million, but by 2050, Japan is expected to be down to 107 million. Can you imagine shedding 20 million people over the next 35 years in Japan? What do you do? I mean, Japan is not a country that's ever been open to immigration. You're Japanese or you're not Japanese in Japan. Okay, I mean, fifth generation Koreans living in Japan still don't get citizenship in Japan. Okay, so this is one of those things that Japan is a very, very hard country to break into. And Thailand, which was the fastest growing economy in the world from 1985 to 1997, which was a demand-based economy, look at the population in the next 35 years is not going to grow. All right, so you can see that the populations for these different places look wildly different, right? And if I'm sitting and thinking about how do I put a strategy together, either a strategy for the corporate strategy or a strategy for my markets, okay, I have to keep these population trends in mind. Okay, now look, if I look at the world population reports, and let's look at some of these. Now, this is a rather dense slide, but in 2005, it was estimated that Russia would lose 1/3 of its population by 2050. Okay, Russia has lost more than 15 million people in the last 15 years. Now look, the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of Russians have come back home, but by and large, Russia has been shedding population. Okay, hard-hit regions around the world for population are things like Eastern Europe. Look at these places like Albania. From 2005 to 2015, they lost, close to 400,000 people, or about 10% of their population. If I look at Armenia, Armenia lost right at 20% of its population in a decade. That's enormous, right? If I look at Bosnia, okay, Bosnia lost 15% of their population in a period of 13 years. Okay, if I look at Bulgaria, okay, last year from 1990 to 2011, okay, in a period of 21 years, they lost 24% of their population. or about 600,000 people every year. You know, you can see these numbers, they're just incredible. And when I look at a place like Puerto Rico, okay, now look, they got hit with a very, very bad hurricane, and it decimated the economic activity of the country. But the population between 2017 and 2019, they lost 8.2% of their population. If I look at a place like Venezuela, in the last 2 years, they've lost almost 3% of their population. Some of these countries are losing a lot of population. So one of the things we have to do is we have to recognize where people are and where people are not going to be, okay? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, as I said, age. So let's look at the young and let's look at the old. Okay, on the left, we have the young countries. Okay, Angola. Now, look, I don't have every country up here listed, but some of the ones that you would recognize. We have countries like Angola. How young is Angola? 15.9 years of age is the median age. It means half the population is under 15.9 years of age. Afghanistan, 18.9. Burkina Faso, okay, 17.3. Look at Niger, 15.4. Can you imagine a society in which 50% of the population is below 15 and a half? That is a young population, right? India, 28. Pakistan, 23.8. These are young populations. And as I said, young populations have a tendency to do what? Reproduce themselves. Now, on the other side, let's look at some of the old, okay? Now, I have these a little bit more in order over here. Monaco, 53.1. Japan, the second oldest population on the planet, 47.3. Germany, 47.1. Italy, 45.5. Greece, 44.5. You could just see how old some of these populations tend to be. That is that 50% of their population has already moved beyond reproduction. That means that these countries are going to be destined to very, very low population growth in the future. Okay? So keep your eye on these things, right? As you're starting to develop strategies, recognize that this might be the case. Now, I want to pull your eye or your attention to this first point. In 2011 to 12, it was estimated by the Population Reference Bureau that 97% of population growth would occur in developing countries. They revised that in 2017 to be 99% of the population growth would take place in developing countries. So the developing countries are where the growth is going to take place. The developed countries, there's just not any people in those countries. Now, what happens in the future? Well, do we have migrations? Do we have wars? Do we have repopulations and resettlements? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that if I'm making my bets over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and I'm thinking about where factories need to go in and where labor is going to be cheap, I'm looking for young populations. If I'm thinking about where I'm going to have health care, where I'm going to need to make big diapers, not small diapers, okay, I'm looking at the developed countries. You know, in the developing countries, people are going to be young. They're going to need those household formation goods. In the developed countries, they're going to need medical care. They're going to need services and what have you. All right, so what do we see? We see very, very, very different types of populations. Now, what does this, kind of mean in terms of economic growth rates? And what does it mean in terms of the investment structure that we're going to see? Now, let's look at the economic growth rate of countries. Now, again, I don't have all the countries listed here. Okay, some of these countries that are rather small that would show up on the list. So don't take this as a direct ranking of who's number 1, 2, or whatever. But if I look at the fastest growing economies in the world, Ethiopia, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, China, okay, you see all of these are kind of 7%, 6% or more, right? These are the fast growth economies. Now let's look at the slowest growing economies from 2010 to 2019. Okay, so we look at Venezuela, Greece, Puerto Rico, right? These are all countries that over the last decade, the economy hasn't grown, it's actually declined. Okay, now we look at places like Italy, the Ukraine, Portugal. Okay, for a decade, the total growth, okay, the growth rate for a decade is under 1%. These are not growing economies. What do we see over here on the right? These are usually declining populations. These are usually countries that are not growing in terms of that natural resource or which is employment. Okay, and if I look all the way down the list, that last one, Argentina. Okay, Argentina's growth rate was 1.5. Okay, looking at the rest of the countries up there, that actually sounds fairly high. Take that one with a grain of salt, because 2009 was their financial crisis when the country was decimated, and it grew 25% in the very first year. Okay, so if I were to take Argentina and really take out the 2010 growth, okay, Argentina would probably have been negative for the decade as well. Okay, so as we start to look at these economies, some of the things we got to keep in mind is how fast are they going to grow and what have you. So look, we've talked about the economy and we've talked a little bit about demography. Now I've just scratched the surface on both of these. Okay, when I talk about these topics, I can often talk about them for 30 to 40 hours when I'm running a class on these macro environmental pictures and activities. But one of the things we want to keep in mind here is that when we're looking at these numbers, okay, is what does it mean for you? What does it mean for your businesses? Now I'm going to take, and we've talked about, let me go back here, and we've talked about the issues of the economy. We've talked about demography, and we've talked a little bit about the growth rates and things like this. But let's just move forward for a second and let's talk about what this might mean for some of these other areas. So look, if I'm thinking about this and I look at these populations and I look at these growth rates and I look at these age statistics, what is that going to mean for things like technology? Okay? The solutions are going to be a great deal different. If I look at the technology and I look at the world and I look at the way in which the world is evolving, okay, what do I see? Here's what I look at, here's what I see. And this is why I say, in my lifetime, it was very, very, very much about the economies and interest rates. As I began to experience or, began to move through my career, I would say demography became more and more important. We started to see these slowing birth rates in the developed world. The demand side economies began to run out of gas. Many of the governments began to adjust to that and began to try to get workers to work longer. They tried to get more forced savings. These were the kind of policy fixes that we began to see in places like Canada, the United States, and what have you, because they could see the impending disaster of a retirement system that was government funded. When we look at some of the newer economies, like places like a Singapore, okay, it was all self-funded. They opened up their Provident Fund and got the Singaporeans to save 27% of their income. This was the way they prepared for their eventual aging. Okay, now, if I'm looking at what this is going to mean for technology, okay, I go back to that demographic picture and I look around the world and we look at these populations that have declining populations. What's happening? What do I see? So, people talk about AI. They talk about big data. They talk about automation. So let's talk about these for just a second. Now look, where was the idea of Industry 4.0 started? You know what Industry 4.0 is? Industry 4.0 was all about developing the smart factory, to be able to use things like techniques such as the Internet of Things, where what we could do is we could bring sensors into the factory so that we could remotely monitor the factory, that it would be hands-off, that we would be able to automate the factory and not need laborers in the factory, so that we could be proactive in servicing our machines and things like this. All of this was designed where? Well, it was launched, or the idea was launched at a conference in Hanover, Germany. Okay, this is where the concept of Industry 4.0 was brought together and first talked about. And you know what? If I look around the world and I look at Germany, which has a declining population, I look at Japan, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, the lowest birth populations, the most declining populations in the world, what are they doing? What is their use of technology going forward? Well, these countries tend to be investing in what? They're investing in automation. They're looking at the factory because they were supply-side economies. That is the DNA. That is the basis of their companies. It's the basis of the way they went to market. It's the basis of the way that they think. And when they're looking at automation, they're looking at using data. They're using it for what? To enhance the efficiency of manufacturing. I remember I was talking with one of the prime ministers of Thailand once upon a time. And he was talking about big data, and he was talking about automation, and he was talking about winners and losers and how there would need to be payments and how you were going to have transfer payments within the economy because of the clear winners and losers. And I remember when he left the room and I sat back and I turned to my colleague and I said, you know, this is when I really began to understand the differences in population and what they were going to mean. In a country like Singapore, in a country like Korea, in a country like Japan, they're automating like crazy because they don't have any young people. And if people are going to continue to get their services, if they're going to continue to live at a high level, they're going to have to be able to do it with what? Less labor. And the Singaporean government is always telling businesses, automate, 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 automate. Okay? On the other hand, when I look at the Americans come from what? They come from a demand-side economy. And as the Americans come from a demand-side economy, okay, they look at the world completely differently. When they're looking at big data, when they're looking at digitization, when they're looking at digital connect, when they're looking at artificial intelligence, what do we use it for in America? We use it to do better connect with the customers. Americans are always thinking about how do I develop a platform and develop a platform that allows me to sell more, to get more through the pipe. Well, the Germans, the Koreans, the Japanese are talking about bringing their costs down, being very operationally focused, being able to produce for less, to be able to produce more with fewer resources. What the Americans are doing is looking at how do I better satisfy that customer? How do I connect with that customer? How do I provide an online experience that enhances their willingness to buy? And this, I think, is where these things will change the world. Now look, if we had more time, I would talk about things like the law, you know, the difference between common law, civil law. Okay, we could talk statutory law. Okay, all of these things are quite a bit different. Okay, but today what we've done is we've talked about the economy, we've talked about the demography, and lastly, we've begun to think about how that's going to affect the way in which we use technology going forward. Now look, if I'm in a country like Singapore, I'm worried about being able to get everything done with a limited population. Same thing in Japan. If I'm in a country like India, what am I afraid of? I have a huge population that I need to keep active. Right? These are going to be some of the big challenges as we move forward. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it.